The letter sat on the table for 3 days before Callum Ward mailed it. He had written it on a Tuesday in the last hour before the fire died down, with the wind pressing hard against the north wall of the cabin and making the kind of sounds that a man alone on a mountain either learns to ignore or never does. Callum had learned to ignore them years ago. He was good at ignoring things. It was one of his better qualities depending on who you asked, and there was almost no one left to ask. The letter was not long. Callum was not a man who used words carelessly, the same way he did not use ammunition carelessly or daylight, or the good flour he kept in the sealed tin on the second shelf. Every word he put down on paper cost him something, and so he chose them the way a careful man chooses where to step on ice one at a time, testing the weight before he committed. He had addressed the letter to the Hartwell Correspondence Agency of Chicago, Illinois, whose advertisement he had cut from a 2-month-old newspaper that had arrived in Millhaven with the supply wagon in late October. The advertisement was small and plainly worded, which was what had caught his attention in the first place. Callum distrusted florid language on principle. A man who needed too many words to say a thing usually did not trust the thing he was saying. The advertisement read, Hartwell Agency, respectable women of good character seeking frontier partners. Correspondence arranged, reasonable fees, discretion assured. That was all. No promises of beauty or devotion or the particular kind of domestic happiness that other such advertisements sold like patent medicine. Just respectable women of good character. Callum had read it 4 times, which was 3 more times than he usually gave anything, and then he had folded it and put it in his shirt pocket and not looked at it again for 6 weeks. That was September. By the time he sat down to write the letter, it was late November, and Emmett Pruitt had been dead for 31 days. He had not counted the days on purpose. He had simply known the way a man who lives by seasons and storms and the particular quality of morning light knows things without trying. 31 days since the rescue party had found Emmett in the snow 300 yards from his own front door, one hand still reaching toward the cabin he had never made it back to. 31 days since Callum had stood at the graveside in Millhaven while Reverend Coles said the words over the frozen ground, and since Sheriff Roy Dugan had put a hand on Callum's shoulder and said something that Callum had not quite heard because he was listening to the wind instead. He had heard it later, though. Not Dugan's words. Emmett's words. Words from 6 months before the accident spoken at Callum's table over venison stew and bad coffee on a night when the two of them had been talking, or rather when Emmett had been talking, and Callum had been listening, which was how their conversations usually worked. "You are going to die alone on this mountain," Emmett had said, not with cruelty, but with the matter-of-fact bluntness of a man who had known Callum Ward for 11 years and had long since stopped softening things. "And nobody will know for 3 days, maybe 4. You will be in here for 4 days before anyone thinks to ride up and check." Callum had said something dismissive. He could not remember what. Emmett had laughed, which was something Emmett did easily and often, and had poured himself more coffee and let it go. He had not pushed. Emmett never pushed. He only said the true thing once and then allowed a man his dignity. But the thing about a true thing said plainly by someone who knows you is that it does not leave. It moves in. It finds a corner of the mind and sets itself down and does not trouble you every hour or every day. But it is there when the house is quiet and the fire is low and there is nothing between you and the dark outside but a few inches of pine log and your own thinking. 4 days. Maybe 4. Callum had been alone on Bear Creek Ridge for 6 years by then, not counting the winter Eleanor had stayed, which he had mostly stopped counting. He was 44 years old. He had 30 pounds of dried venison, 4 cords of firewood, 2 horses, and 1 rifle that had never failed him. He had a cabin that did not leak except for 3 places on the roof that he kept meaning to fix, and a root cellar that was better stocked than most families in the valley. He had 11 volumes of books on the shelf above the fireplace, including a copy of Walt Whitman that he had read so many times the spine had cracked twice and been repaired with rawhide. He had everything a man needed. He had written the letter on a Tuesday. "I require a woman of good health and small stature," he wrote, "because the trail to Bear Creek Ridge is narrow and steep and better suited to persons of modest build. I am not a man of elaborate tastes or easy conversation. The work here is physical, and the winters are long. I can provide shelter and provision and fair treatment. I am prepared to offer $30 gold and the cost of rail passage one way. What I require in return is a woman who will not be frightened of this life and who understands that I mean what I say and say what I mean. I do not require beauty or accomplishments. I require durability." He had read it back once. Then he had added at the bottom in smaller letters, as though he hoped it might not be noticed, "I have been alone for some time. I do not know how to want company in the ordinary way, but I am told it is unwise to go on as I have been." He did not say who had told him. Emmett Pruitt was in the ground and could not be embarrassed by the mention. He folded the letter, sealed it with wax, and left it on the table for 3 days while he decided whether he was a man who would actually send such a thing or only a man who had written it. On Friday morning he put it in his coat pocket, rode down the mountain to Millhaven, handed it to the postmaster, without making eye contact, bought 2 pounds of salt and a box of lamp oil wicks, and rode back up before noon. He told himself he felt nothing in particular about it. He was lying, but he was a man who had practiced lying to himself about certain things, and he was very good at it by now. The settlement of Millhaven, Montana Territory in the winter of 1887 was the kind of place that existed because geography required it and stubbornness sustained it. It sat at the base of the eastern slope of a range of mountains that had no formal name on any map Callum had ever seen, but which the people who lived near them called the Graybacks, for the color they turned in winter when the snow settled into the rock faces and the two became indistinguishable. There were perhaps 200 people in and around Millhaven if you counted generously and included the homesteaders scattered across the lower valleys, which Callum generally did not since most of them were gone by the time you needed to count them for anything. The town had a general store, a feed and hardware, a blacksmith, a livery, a church of uncertain denomination that served also as a schoolhouse and occasionally as a courtroom, a saloon called Holt's that served also as a barber shop if you asked on the right day, and a small 2-room building that served as Sheriff Duggan's office and jail, and sometimes as his bedroom when the ride home seemed like too much effort. There was a doctor who was also the dentist, a practice that did not inspire confidence in either capacity, but which the residents had made their peace with. It was not a beautiful town. It was a useful one, which in that country and that time was considered a higher compliment anyway. The people of Millhaven knew Callum Ward the way people in small settlements know anyone who has been proximate but not intimate for many years. They knew his face and his horse and the particular sound of his boots on the boardwalk outside Holt's when he came down the mountain once or twice a month for supplies. They knew he did not stop to talk and that he paid for what he bought and that he never ran a tab and that he had once carried a man out of a collapsed mine shaft on his back and set him down on the street without waiting to be thanked. They knew he had come to Montana 11 years ago from somewhere east and that he had been married and that the wife had left, and that he did not discuss any of these things. They knew because Millhaven was small and winter was long and there was not much else to do that he had mailed a letter to Chicago in late November. They knew this because Carl Ames, the postmaster, was not a man who could keep interesting information to himself, which was perhaps not the ideal quality in a postmaster, but which the residents of Millhaven had learned to account for the way they accounted for all the town's other structural imperfections. Carl had not told anyone directly. He had simply mentioned in passing at Holt's one evening that old Callum Ward had sent a letter down to the city addressed to one of those agencies, you know the kind, and had then allowed the assembled company to draw their own conclusions, which they did with the focused enthusiasm of people who did not have enough to do. By the first week of December, most of Millhaven had formed an opinion about what Callum Ward's bride would look like when she arrived, assuming she arrived. Assuming anyone agreed to come, which some of them doubted. Roy Duggan, who had a methodical mind, and 20 years of reading people, said she would be small and nervous, and probably from New England, the kind of woman who had read about the frontier in a magazine and had a somewhat romantic idea of what it entailed. Ira Mosbeck, who ran the feed and hardware, and who had an unbroken record of being wrong about almost everything that did not involve livestock, said she would be a widow, middle-aged, stout, practical, probably German. Tommy Greer, who was 26 and the son of the general store owner, and who had a habit of involving himself in things that were not strictly his business, said nothing in public but privately thought that whoever she was going to need someone to explain to her what she was getting into, and he considered himself well positioned to provide that service. And Hattie Oakes, who was 63 years old and ran the only rooming house in Millhaven, and who had seen enough of life to have stopped being surprised by most of it, said only that she hoped the woman had good boots and a warm coat, because Bear Creek Ridge in February would sort out the rest soon enough. Nobody said what they were all thinking underneath all of it, which was that they were curious what kind of woman would come to a man like Callum Ward, and what kind of man Callum Ward must secretly be to have asked. Up on the mountain, the man in question split firewood and checked his beaver traps, and read his Whitman, and did not think about Chicago. Or so he told himself. He was still lying. There is a particular kind of waiting that a man does not admit to himself he is doing. He goes about his work. He eats when he is hungry, and sleeps when it is dark, and rises when the light comes. He does not watch for the mail rider any more than usual. He does not count days. He does not on a cold, clear morning when the air is so sharp it feels like breathing glass stand on the porch of his cabin and look down through the pines toward the valley below with any particular expectation. He simply lives his life, and somewhere underneath the living of it, quieter than the wind and more patient than the snow, something waits. Callum Ward was a self-aware enough man to know this about himself, which made it worse because knowing did not stop it and could not, and so it simply sat there in him, this quiet, irrational waiting, and he did not speak of it and did not address it and moved around it every day, the way you move around furniture in a room you have lived in long enough that you no longer see it. The reply from the Hartwell agency arrived on a Thursday in December, 6 weeks after his letter. He was in the barn when the mail rider came, a boy of about 16 named Pete Garfield, who made the run from Millhaven 3 times a week and who had learned early that Callum Ward did not want conversation with his correspondence. Pete left the letter on the porch railing and rode off without calling out which was the arrangement they had arrived at without ever discussing it. Callum found it when he came in from the barn. He picked it up and looked at the return address for a moment. Then he went inside, hung up his coat, washed his hands, poured himself coffee, sat down at the table, and opened it. The Hartwell agency wrote in a careful, neutral hand that managed to convey both reassurance and the quiet professional authority of people who handle delicate matters every day. They thanked him for his inquiry. They indicated that his application had been reviewed and that they were pleased to inform him that a candidate had been identified who appeared well suited to the conditions he had described. They noted that the candidate was a woman of Irish birth and Boston residence aged 31 of good health and sound character, experienced with physical labor and outdoor life, possessing the fortitude they believed his situation required. Callum read this paragraph twice. The letter continued. The candidate had reviewed his correspondence and had expressed willingness to proceed should he agree. The agency would arrange passage by rail to Billings, Montana, after which local transport to Millhaven could be coordinated. The fee of $30 gold should be forwarded upon confirmation, along with the cost of rail passage, which the agency estimated at $11.40 for second-class accommodation. If he was satisfied to proceed, he should write to confirm within 2 weeks. There was a postscript written in slightly smaller letters at the bottom of the page as though it had been added as an afterthought, or perhaps as something the writer had debated including it all. The postscript read, "The candidate has asked that we convey the following directly in her own words." She writes, "I have read the gentleman's letter with care. I understand what is being offered and what is being asked. I am not a woman of small stature, as he has specified, and I want him to know this before any arrangements are made so that the decision is made with full information. I am a practical woman, and I dislike surprises. I imagine he may feel the same." Callum sat with the letter for a long time. The fire moved in the stove. The wind went about its business against the north wall. Outside, one of the horses moved in the barn, and the sound carried faintly through the cold air. He read the postscript again. And then he did something he had not done in longer than he could easily account for, which was to sit back in his chair and be genuinely uncertain what to do next. The Hartwell agency had included, as was their custom, a brief description of the candidate's particulars. Height approximately 5 feet 10 inches. Build, he read, substantial. Hands experienced with heavy labor. Former occupation cooperage work and farm assistance. He thought about the trail up to Bear Creek Ridge, the switchbacks, the place just below the second ridge where the path narrowed to barely the width of a horse's shoulder, and the drop on the left side was something most people tried not to look at directly. He thought about Emmett Pruitt in the snow reaching toward a door he had not made it to. He wrote back to the Hartwell Agency the following morning. The letter contained 4 sentences. The first confirmed that he wished to proceed. The second enclosed the required funds. The third asked that the agency communicate to the candidate that her directness had been noted and was considered a point in her favor. The fourth said he would expect her arrival at Millhaven no later than February. He mailed it on Friday. He did not tell anyone in Millhaven what the letter had contained, but Roy Dugan noticed that Callum, when he came down for supplies that week, paused in front of the general store window long enough to look at something inside, and that the something appeared to be a bolt of dark blue wool fabric that would have been of no practical use to a man who lived alone. Dugan mentioned this to no one, but he did update his private estimate of the situation, which he kept, the way he kept all useful information quietly and to himself against the day when it might be needed. Upstairs in his cabin on Bear Creek Ridge that night, Callum Ward lay awake for a while, which was unusual for him since he was generally the kind of man who went to sleep the way he did most things, with a practical efficiency that left no room for negotiation. He looked at the ceiling, which he knew as well as he knew his own hands. He thought about a woman he had never met who had sent a message through an agency in Chicago to tell him she was not what he had asked for, and who had apparently done so because she disliked surprises and assumed he felt the same. He did feel the same. He had always felt the same. He did not know what to do with that. Eventually the fire settled and the cabin cooled, and the mountain went on being dark and quiet and enormous around him and Callum Ward, who had lived alone for 6 years and who had stopped needing things he could not name, fell asleep thinking about nothing in particular, which is to say he fell asleep thinking about the same thing he had been thinking about for 6 weeks. The train out of Boston's South Station departed on a Wednesday morning in late January, and Bridget Calhoun was on it with one large trunk, one smaller traveling bag, $14 of her own money sewn into the lining of her coat, and the address of the Hartwell Agency written on a card in her coat pocket, which she no longer needed because she had memorized it, but which she kept anyway because she was a woman who liked to have things she could put her hand on when she needed reassurance. She was not a woman who needed reassurance often, but she was a practical woman, as she had told the agency she was, and part of being practical was acknowledging the situations in which a person might reasonably want it. This was one of those situations. She had told her brother Declan about the arrangement on a Sunday afternoon, 2 weeks before departure, sitting across from him at the kitchen table of the house that had been their parents' house, and that was now, through a series of financial decisions Declan had made, that Bridget preferred not to dwell on at length, mostly the bank's house. Declan had listened with the particular expression he wore when he was trying to determine whether he was in trouble, and then when she had finished explaining, he had said, "Bridget, that is the mountains. That is the far mountains." "Yes," she had said, "that is where it is." He had looked at his hands, which were the same large, broad hands their father had had transplanted somewhat incongruously onto a man who had never done a full, honest day of labor with them. A man who is willing to pay $30 gold and a train ticket for a wife. Declan said carefully, is either a very good man in a difficult situation or a very strange one in a worse situation. "I am aware of the possibilities," Bridget said. "And you're going anyway." "I am going anyway." He had not argued further, which she appreciated. Declan had many faults, but he was not a man who argued with her when she had made up her mind, having learned some years ago that this was an activity roughly as productive as arguing with the tide. She had not told him about the other part, the part in the postscript, the part she had insisted the agency include before she would agree to proceed. This was partly because it was her business and not Declan's, and partly because explaining it would have required explaining things she had no particular desire to explain even to her brother, even in a kitchen that was already not quite theirs anymore. The things she would have had to explain went back 7 years to a Tuesday afternoon in the back of the cooperage where she worked alongside 4 other women and 6 men, making barrels for the fish packing houses down by the harbor. She had been 24 years old and recently engaged to a man named Seamus Hennessy, who worked the caulking boats and who had a good laugh and a broad smile, and who she had believed for approximately 8 months was a person who saw her clearly and liked what he saw. The message had come through her younger cousin Nora, who was also Seamus's neighbor, and who had the look of a person carrying something heavy when she appeared at the cooperage door that Tuesday afternoon and asked Bridget if she could step outside for a moment. He says Nora had told her, staring somewhere past Bridget's left shoulder, that he thinks you're a fine person. He just says you're not the kind of woman a man pictures when he pictures a wife. Bridget had stood on the cobblestones outside the cooperage with the smell of the harbor coming off the wind and the sound of the barrels being stacked inside, and she had thought with great clarity, so that is the word for it. Not the kind of woman a man pictures. She was 5 feet 10 inches tall, which in a woman of Irish Boston in 1880 was approximately 4 inches taller than was comfortable for the people around her. She was wide at the shoulders from years of rolling and lifting and stacking. Her hands were capable hands, working hands, the kind of hands that got things done, and they were also, she was aware, the kind of hands that made certain men uneasy in ways they did not always have the self-knowledge to articulate clearly. Her face was her mother's face, wide-boned and strong-featured, not the delicate, fine-boned face that the magazines and the illustrated papers presented as the correct version of a woman's face. She was not ugly. She knew she was not ugly. But she was also not the kind of woman a man pictured when he pictured a wife, apparently, and Seamus Hennessy had at least had the decency to say so before the wedding, rather than after, which she had given him credit for grudgingly over the years. She had gone back into the cooperage and finished the afternoon's work. She had not cried until she was home, and then only briefly in the dark, in a way she was fairly certain no one heard. And then she had gotten up the next morning and gone back to work because the barrels did not care about Seamus Hennessy, and neither, she had decided, would she. 7 years was a long time, and she had mostly kept that decision. Mostly. There were still moments, usually in the company of women who were small and fine-boned and effortlessly the kind of woman a man pictured, when the thing rose up in her like water coming through a crack in a floor. She had learned to step over the crack when she saw it coming. She was good at it by now. But the crack was still there, and she had been stepping over it for 7 years, and she was tired of the particular kind of tiredness that comes not from working hard, but from always watching where you step. The Hartwell Agency's advertisement had appeared in a women's magazine that she had not bought, but that had been left by someone on the bench at the trolley stop, and that she had picked up and read on the ride home because she had forgotten her own reading material that morning. The advertisement had been on the third to last page, small and plain, positioned between an advertisement for a hair tonic and an advertisement for a Christian ladies' reading circle, respectable women of good character seeking frontier partners. She had read it twice on the trolley, and then she had folded the magazine and put it in her bag. She had written to the agency from her own name with her own description on paper she had bought specifically for the purpose. She had not tried to make herself sound smaller or softer, or more like the kind of woman a man pictures. She had written what she was because she had decided at some point that she could not precisely locate, but which felt located somewhere in the vicinity of a Tuesday afternoon 7 years ago on cobblestones smelling of the harbor, that she was done managing other people's comfort about what she was. The agency had written back. There was a candidate who had specified she read. She had laughed out loud at that alone in her room, which was not something she did often. A man who specified small. And then she had read the rest of the letter about Bear Creek Ridge and the work and the winters, and she had thought about it for 3 days, which was about 2 days longer than she usually needed to think about anything. She had thought about what it would mean to go to a place where she had never been, to a man she had never met who had asked for something she was not. She had thought about what it would mean to stay in Boston in a house that was mostly the bank's now, in a cooperage that might close in a city where she had spent 7 years stepping over the same crack. She had written to the agency on the 4th day. She had specified that before any correspondence was exchanged or any arrangements were made, the man needed to know she was not what he had described in plain language, so that whatever happened next was happening with full information on both sides. She had used the word surprises because she meant it. She disliked surprises. She suspected from the tone and content of his letter that he did too. His response when the agency forwarded it had been 4 sentences. She had read it 4 times, which was the same number of times she rarely gave anything. The third sentence had stayed with her. Her directness had been noted and was considered a point in her favor. Not forgiven, not overlooked. Noted and considered a point in her favor. She had looked at that sentence for a long time. Then she had written back to say she would come. The train was warm in the way that trains are warm, which is to say unevenly, with the car itself holding a general heat that was interrupted by cold drafts from the windows and the doors at either end, and by the specific cold of the metal on the seat frames, and by the cold that came off the other passengers' coats when they moved past. Bridget had a window seat on the south side of the car which gave her the afternoon sun until it went down, and she had organized her bag on the seat beside her in a way that discouraged casual conversation, which she found she needed on a journey this long. It was not that she disliked people. She liked people reasonably well. But she was also a person who needed quiet, the way she needed sleep regularly, and in sufficient quantity, and 6 days on a train was a long time to be in a space with strangers. She had brought 2 books. She had brought paper for writing, though she was not sure what she would write. She had brought a tin of shortbread from the bakery near the cooperage, the almond kind, made by a woman named Mrs. Farrell, who had been making it the same way since before Bridget was born. She had brought it partly because she liked it, and partly because it was the kind of thing you brought when you were leaving somewhere and wanted to have one last piece of it with you. She was on the second day when she met Helga Brenner. Helga was 67 years old and built like a woman who had spent 67 years doing things that needed doing, which is to say solidly and without apology. She was traveling to Wyoming to find her son who had gone west 3 years ago with the intention of establishing a cattle operation, and who had been writing her letters at irregular intervals that told her less than she wanted to know about how he was actually doing. She was carrying a basket covered with a cloth that turned out to contain a quite remarkable amount of food, and she was in the seat across the aisle from Bridget, and she had looked at Bridget on the morning of the second day with the appraising, direct look of a woman who had no time for the kind of social performance that required pretending not to look. "You are going west for a man," Helga said. It was not a question. Bridget looked up from her book. "Yes." Helga nodded as though this confirmed something she had already worked out. She reached into her basket and produced 2 hard-boiled eggs and offered one to Bridget without ceremony. Bridget took it. "He is the right kind?" Helga asked. "I do not know yet." Helga considered this. "That is honest," she said. She peeled her egg with the efficiency of a woman who had peeled a great many eggs. "What made you go?" Bridget thought about this for a moment. "Boston stopped being a place where I could find out," she said finally. "I thought somewhere I had not been might tell me something different." Helga looked at her the way a person looks at a piece of ground they are considering buying. Not hostile, just thorough. Then she said, "You will survive the mountain. I can tell." Her voice held no particular flattery in it. It was more like a foreman telling a new worker that the job was within their capacity, a simple assessment of what she saw. They talked for the better part of the afternoon and into the evening in the comfortable way of people who understand they will probably not see each other again and can therefore dispense with the social maintenance that long acquaintance requires. Helga told her about her son and about the farm in Pennsylvania where she had raised him, and about her husband Hans, who had died of a fever when the boy was 9, and how she had run the farm herself for 4 years before selling it and coming to the city. She told these things not as complaints but as facts. The narrative of a life with the particular calm of a woman who had looked at her life squarely and had made her accommodation with it. Bridget told her some things in return, not everything, not the part about Seamus or the crack in the floor or the 7 years of stepping carefully, but enough that Helga at the end of it nodded again in the way she had and said only, "Good. Just good." As though Bridget had answered a question correctly on a test she had not known she was taking. Helga got off the train at Cheyenne in the early afternoon with her basket and her considerable traveling bag, moving with the purposeful, unhurried pace of a woman who knew exactly where she was going. She waved once without turning around, a brief backward wave like someone brushing away a fly, and then she was gone through the platform crowd, and Bridget was looking at the space where she had been. The train went on. The landscape outside the windows changed in the way it changes west of the Mississippi gradually, and then all at once, as though the country were getting tired of being managed and had decided to show you what it looked like when left alone. The hills flattened and then rose and then flattened again. The trees thinned out and the sky opened up into something that was not the sky she knew, which was the sky of a city bounded and qualified by buildings and soot and the particular gray that settles over a place where a great many people live very close together. This sky was different. It was the kind of sky that makes some people feel free and other people feel afraid depending on which you were more ready for at that particular moment in your life. Bridget looked at it and felt something that was not quite either. She felt something closer to reckoning, the feeling of a person who has made a decision and is now close enough to the consequences of it to see their shape, if not yet their details. She had made this decision. She had made it with her eyes open, or as open as eyes can be when looking at something you have never seen. She had told the man she was coming, and he had said, "Come." Whatever was waiting on the other side of 6 days of train and 2 days of coach and a mountain road that she had been told was steep, she had chosen it. She found when she looked at the sky and looked at herself honestly that she was not afraid of the mountain. She was afraid of other things, smaller things in the way that the things we carry the longest are usually smaller than the things that happen to us only once. She was afraid of being looked at and found insufficient not by the mountain which did not care but by the man. She was afraid of arriving at a place that was supposed to be different and finding that the crack in the floor had followed her because some cracks are not in the floor but in the person walking on it, and there is no train that takes you far enough from those. She ate the last of Mrs. Farrell's shortbread on the 5th day, the almond kind in the fading afternoon light with the mountains beginning to show on the western horizon, small, still, and blue-gray like something that had not quite decided yet whether it was cloud or stone. She thought about a man she had never met who had written, "I require durability," and then in smaller letters, "I do not know how to want company in the ordinary way." She had read that sentence a number of times. She had read it the way you read something that tells you something true without meaning to, which is to say carefully and more than once, and without quite admitting to yourself why you keep coming back to it. She did not know what kind of man he was. She had the evidence of his handwriting, which was spare and angular and consistent, and the evidence of his words, which were spare in the same way, and the evidence of his third sentence, which was the one she kept returning to. She had the evidence of the agency's description, which told her he was 44 years old and 6 feet tall and had lived alone on a mountain in Montana for 6 years, which told her things without telling her the most important things, which is always how it is with descriptions of people. She knew that he had lost someone. The word alone, placed the way he had placed it, was the word of a man who had not chosen aloneness so much as arrived at it by a road he had not entirely mapped. She recognized this in the same way she recognized certain things about herself, not because anyone had explained it to her, but because some things you know when you hear them, the way you know a note that is just slightly off from where it should be, not wrong exactly, but not quite right either. She put the shortbread tin away and looked at the mountains, which were bigger now. She thought, "I will get there and I will see him, and we will both know immediately whether this is possible, and it will be either something or nothing. And either way, I will have chosen, which is more than I had 6 months ago." This was not the most comforting thought she had ever had, but it was an honest one, and honest was the thing she could give herself, which was always the thing she found most reliably useful in the long run. The train rolled west. The mountains grew. The sky above them was the color it turns at altitude in winter, a particular cold blue that has very little mercy in it and very much beauty, and which does not ask your opinion of either. Billings Station was cold and loud in the way of small railroad stations that are the last stop before somewhere even more remote, full of the particular energy of arrivals and departures and the commerce that attaches itself to both. Bridget stepped off the train with her trunk and her bag and the address card she no longer needed, and stood on the platform for a moment adjusting to the cold, which was a different and more serious cold than Boston cold, a cold with intention behind it. She was arranging her trunk toward the luggage cart area when a man stepped out of the group of men loitering near the station entrance. He was perhaps 40, red-faced with the smell of whiskey that was either recent or permanent, wearing a sheepskin coat that needed cleaning. He said something to her that she did not catch the words of, but caught the tone of which was the tone of a man making an assessment out loud that he had not been asked for. She did not look at him directly. She took hold of her trunk and moved it 6 feet to the left, which put her at a different angle to the wall. He moved too. He said it again, louder. She set the trunk down. She looked at him, then directly the way she looked at things she was going to have to deal with. He was slightly shorter than her and considerably less steady on his feet. She put one hand on the front of his coat calmly and walked him backward 3 steps until he was against the station wall, and she said quietly enough that only he could hear, "I am not that kind of woman. Do you understand me?" He understood her. She picked up her trunk and found the luggage cart. Several people on the platform had seen this and were now not looking in her direction with the focused deliberateness of people who are definitely looking in your direction. She paid this no more attention than she paid the cold. She found the driver for the Millhaven stage, a taciturn man named Hicks, who looked at her and her trunk and said only, "How much does the trunk weigh?" And she said, "It weighs what it weighs. Can you take it?" And he said yes. And that was the end of their conversation. In the coach, she found herself seated across from a young man who introduced himself as Tommy Greer of the Millhaven Greers, with the cheerful ease of someone who had never had difficulty in social situations and who assumed this was universally relatable. He was handsome in an uncomplicated way, with an open face and good teeth, and the air of a person who had not yet had anything serious enough happen to him to change the expression that was currently on his face. He talked about Millhaven for the first hour. He talked easily and without much self-consciousness, which she found to her mild surprise not entirely unpleasant. Some people talked because they were afraid of silence, and the talking was a kind of armor. Tommy Greer talked because he was genuinely interested in everything around him and had a lot of observations about it, and while she did not always share his conclusions, she respected the impulse. He asked somewhere in the second hour what brought her to Millhaven. She told him. She saw no reason not to. He processed this information with the brief flicker of something moving behind his eyes, and then said, "Callum Ward." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment, which was the first quiet moment she had witnessed from him. Then, "He is not an easy man, Miss Calhoun." She looked out the window at the country going by, which was enormous and white and going dark at the edges where the afternoon was coming to an end. She said, "I did not ask for easy." Tommy Greer looked at her for a moment longer than was polite, the way people look at things that have surprised them. Then he nodded just once and turned to look out his own window. They did not talk much for the rest of the ride. She looked at the mountains. They were close now. The Graybacks, she thought, though she did not know that name yet. They rose against the evening sky with the particular blunt authority of things that have been in one place for a very long time and have no intention of moving for anyone's convenience. There was snow on the upper slopes, packed and blue in the fading light. Somewhere up there, she thought. Somewhere up there in the dark and the cold, a man who did not know how to want company in the ordinary way was waiting or not waiting, or doing both at once, in the way that people do when they have trained themselves not to admit to one thing while being entirely unable to stop doing it. She had a few hours yet before she would know which. She thought about the station in Billings. She thought about the man against the wall and the expression on his face and the way the platform had gone quiet around her. She thought about Helga Brenner waving without turning around. She thought about Mrs. Farrell's shortbread gone now. She thought about a man she had never met who had written her directness was a point in her favor. Outside the mountains came toward her, the way mountains do, slowly, and then not slowly, and then all at once they were simply there, filling the window from edge to edge, and there was no more distance to cross except the last of it. She straightened her back. She looked at the mountains. She was ready or she was not, and either way, she was here. Millhaven, in the last hour of afternoon light in January, looked exactly like what it was, which was a place that had been built by people who needed a place and had not had time to make it beautiful. The buildings along the main street were mostly wood, weathered to the particular gray that wood becomes in mountain country after enough winters have worked on it, standing with the slightly leaning, slightly compressed look of structures that had been built fast and had been adjusting to the reality of their situation ever since. Smoke came from chimneys. A dog moved across the street from one side to the other with the purposeful air of a dog that had somewhere specific to be. The mountains stood behind everything enormous and indifferent the way they always stood. The stage came in from the east on the Billings Road and slowed as it passed the first buildings, and by the time it reached the area in front of Holt's saloon, it had gathered without any particular announcement a loose collection of people who had found reasons to be in that part of town at that particular hour. Bridget, looking through the coach window, counted 14 people before she stopped counting and adjusted her estimate upward to include the ones standing in doorways and the ones looking out of windows and trying to appear as though they were looking at something else. She had expected something like this. Tommy Greer across from her had gone quiet in the last 10 minutes of the ride, which she had come to understand was not his natural state. He was looking out his own window at the assembled crowd with an expression that was almost but not quite a smile. She noticed not for the first time that he was a young man who was used to things being interesting and who was genuinely pleased when they turned out to be more interesting than expected. She did not need to look out the window to know what the crowd was looking at. She had known since Billings what the crowd would be looking at. The stage stopped. Hicks on the box called out something to the effect that they had arrived, as though this required announcement. Bridget sat for a moment. Not from hesitation exactly, or not only from hesitation, more the way a person pauses before walking into a cold river, not because they have decided not to go in, but because they are acknowledging to themselves that what is about to happen is going to be what it is going to be, and there is value in being present for the acknowledgement. Then she opened the door herself because waiting for someone to open it was not her instinct, and she put her foot out and stepped down. The ground was frozen, and there was an inch of packed snow over the dirt, and her boots found it solidly. She straightened up. She was tall enough that stepping out of the coach brought her immediately to full height in a way that was, she was aware, somewhat more arresting than the average arrival. She had known this about herself for long enough that she had made her peace with it. She did not make herself smaller. There was no version of making herself smaller that had ever led anywhere worth going. She looked at the street. 14 people, or more than 14, looking back at her. She looked at them with the same direct, calm regard she gave most things, not hostile, but not apologetic either. The cold air hit her face, and she let it. Someone in the crowd made a sound, a low, collective intake of breath that was not quite a gasp, but was in the neighborhood of one. Someone else laughed quickly, and then seemed to think better of the laugh and stopped. And then, in the particular way that crowds in small places have of resolving themselves around the person who matters most in a given moment, she became aware of the man. He was standing near the side of the street in front of the saloon's hitching rail with a horse behind him, and his hands not quite in his pockets and not quite out of them. He was tall, as the agency had said, but she had not quite understood from the description what tall would look like on this particular man, which was less a matter of height and more a matter of the way he occupied space, which was the way a piece of the landscape occupies space without effort and without apology. He was wearing a coat of brown leather gone dark at the shoulders and a hat that had been good once and had been working since. His face was what it was, broad and weathered, and carrying about it the face that years of hard weather makes, that required looking at wind and distance and the specific concentration of work done alone. His beard was not entirely even, which told her he had shaved recently and was not entirely practiced at it. He was looking at her, not the way the crowd was looking at her. The crowd was looking with the bright, slightly greedy attention of people witnessing something they will describe later. He was looking with the focused, still attention of a man doing a calculation. She had the sense that he was looking at her the way he might look at terrain he was about to cross, assessing what was there with no particular judgment attached to the assessment, only the need to know accurately. She let him look. She looked back. He was not what she had pictured, though she had told herself she had not pictured anything. He was not the craggy, romantic figure of the frontier stories, nor the brutish, uncommunicative figure of the cautionary ones. He was simply a man who had been outside in hard weather for many years, and who had the face that makes. He looked like someone who was unlikely to be surprised by much, which she found to her mild interest somewhat reassuring. She watched him take her in the whole of her once from boots to hat with the same measuring deliberateness. She watched the thing that moved across his face when he finished, which was not the thing she had seen on other faces doing the same survey. It was not repulsion or disappointment exactly. It was something more like the expression of a man who has opened a map and found that it does not quite match the territory he is standing in, and who is in the process of determining whether this is the map's fault or the territory's. She waited for him to speak first, which was not her usual habit, but which seemed in this particular circumstance the correct one. He was quiet for a moment that was long enough to be noticed and short enough not to be rude. Then he stepped forward 2 deliberate steps, closing the space between them to the distance of a conversation rather than an appraisal. He said quietly, "Not for the crowd. You filled out the form." She said, "I filled it out completely. Your agency chose what to forward." He received this without visible reaction. He looked at her again briefly, and she had the sense that what he was looking for now was different from what he had been looking for a moment ago. Less inventory, more something else. Assessment of a different kind. He said, "Can you ride?" She said yes. He said, "The trail is steep. 2 hours up." She said, "I was told." He looked away then just for a moment at something across the street that was not anything in particular the way people look away when they are thinking something they are not ready to say. Then he looked back. He said, "The agency did not give you what you were told to expect either." She considered this. She said, "No." He said with no particular inflection that she could read, "We are even then." And then he turned and went to his horse without another word, not inviting her to follow, and not telling her not to, simply moving toward the next thing that needed doing, which was apparently untying the horse. She looked at him for a moment. She looked at the crowd who were looking at her with the fixed attention of people watching something they are not sure how to categorize. She looked at Tommy Greer, who had descended from the coach behind her and was standing at the edge of things with an expression that was thoughtful and not quite as easy as usual. She lifted her traveling bag from where Hicks had placed it, and she went to the horse and she said, "I need the trunk as well." Callum looked at the trunk which Hicks was in the process of unloading. He said nothing, but he tied his horse back to the rail and went and took one end of the trunk, and Hicks took the other, and they moved it to a position that would allow it to be loaded onto the pack saddle he had apparently brought for this purpose, which told her things she filed away. He had planned for luggage. He had brought a second horse with a pack arrangement. He had thought about what she would need practically before she arrived. She noted this without saying anything about it. Roy Duggan appeared at her elbow while Callum was loading the trunk, materializing with the unhurried ease of a large man who has learned that his size means he does not need to hurry. He touched the brim of his hat. He said, "Miss Calhoun, I am Roy Duggan, Sheriff of Millhaven. You had a safe journey, I hope." She said, "I did, thank you." He said with the elaborate casualness of a man asking something he actually wants to know. "First time in Montana," she said. "First time this far west of anything." He nodded as though this confirmed a general thesis he had been developing. He looked at Callum, who was tying down the trunk with efficient practiced knots, and then back at her. He said, "You know what you are getting into up there," she said. "I know what I have been told. I expect the rest I will learn." Dugan looked at her for a moment with the appraising look of a man who has spent 20 years trying to determine quickly whether people are going to be problems or not. Then he nodded again, a different nod, the kind that means the assessment is concluded and the result is not unfavorable. He said, "Well, you are welcome to Millhaven, Miss Calhoun." Tommy Greer had drifted closer. She was aware of him the way she was aware of most things, peripherally and accurately. He said to the general air, "Miss Calhoun, if you need anything from the store, my father runs Greer's General on the north end of Main Street. We make the supply run up Bear Creek Ridge once a month. If you think of things you need, you can send a list down with whoever is coming that way." She said, "Thank you, Mr. Greer. That is useful to know." He said, "It gets cold up there in a way that is hard to describe to someone who has not experienced it." She said, "I imagine most things are." He opened his mouth and then closed it again, which she had the sense did not happen to him often. He gave her a look that was not unfriendly, not quite, but which had something working in it that she would think about later in a different context. Then he smiled, the easy, uncomplicated smile that seemed to be his default setting, and stepped back. Callum appeared at her shoulder. He said, "Ready." It was not a question. She said yes. The crowd watched them leave. She did not watch the crowd. She had found over the years that the most effective response to being watched was to give the watchers as little as possible to work with, which meant walking exactly as she would walk if no one were watching at the same pace and with the same bearing, without performing either indifference or awareness. The trail up to Bear Creek Ridge began at the north end of Millhaven and went up through the pines immediately without the gradual preparation of foothills, but directly as though the mountain had decided the approach was unnecessary. Callum was on his horse ahead of her, leading the pack animal, and she was on the second riding horse, a bay mare with a steady temperament and good feet, which she had assessed in the first 50 yards of riding and found satisfactory. He had not told her the mare's name. She had not asked. There would be time for that. They rode for the first 30 minutes without speaking, which was fine with her. She was occupied with the trail, which deserved attention. It was exactly as described, steep and in places narrow, with the kind of technical footing that required a horse to think and a rider to stay balanced and present. She did not find it frightening. She found it interesting the way difficult things that require skill are interesting when the skill is available. The trees were dark and close on either side. The cold was the serious cold she had felt at Billings, intensified by altitude and by the shade of the pines, the kind of cold that is not dramatic but simply factual, an ambient condition of the place that everything living in it has arranged itself around. After a time she began to understand what he had meant about the trail and her size, or rather she began to understand that it was not exactly what he had said it was. The trail was narrow in places, yes, but it was navigable. The difficulty was real, but it was the difficulty of competence, not the difficulty of scale. A person who knew how to ride could ride it. A person who did not would struggle regardless of their dimensions. She thought about this without saying anything about it, not because she was not going to say it eventually, but because this was not the time. The trail opened up in one place onto a ledge of rock that gave a view back down the valley, the mountains across the darkening sky above them, the particular quality of space that she had been becoming aware of since the train had crossed into the territory, which was that it was immense, in a way that was not the immenseness of the ocean which she had grown up near, but a different kind. A kind that had more to do with stone and silence and the complete absence of the sounds she had always lived among. She looked at it. He had stopped his horse and was waiting. Not obviously waiting, but waiting nonetheless. And when she looked at him, he was looking at the valley too, with the look of a person who has seen the same view many times and has not stopped seeing it. She said without planning to. "It is very large," he said without looking at her. "Yes." They rode on. He said perhaps 20 minutes later without preamble, "The chimney draws well on the left side. The right side sometimes backs up in strong winds. If you see smoke in the house, open the south window 3 inches. She said, "All right." He said, "The water comes from the upper spring, not the lower. The lower runs off from the mine workings 3 ridges over and should not be used." She said, "I will remember." He said, "The mare you are on is Clara. She does not like sudden noises on the left side. Something happened to her left ear. She does not show it until she shows it all at once, which is worse." She said, "Thank you. I will be careful on the left." He said nothing more for a while. She had the sense that this constituted something, this passing on of information, that it was not small talk, which she understood he did not do, but rather a form of communication that was functional and therefore permissible by whatever internal rules he operated under. He was telling her what she needed to know to survive in the place she was going. It was practical. It was, she thought, also something else, though she was not going to put a name to the something else yet. The cabin appeared through the trees without warning, the way things in dense forest appear suddenly and all at once. It was larger than she had imagined, or rather it was the right size for a man of his dimensions, who also needed to store significant quantities of supplies, which was to say larger than a typical cabin, but purposefully so. It was built of pine logs, chinked well, the kind of construction that had been done by someone who knew what they were doing and who was planning to be inside it during serious weather. There was a barn to the left, also solid. There was a woodpile that was the largest woodpile she had seen outside of a lumber operation. There was a porch across the front covered with 2 sections of log that served as seats. Smoke was coming from the chimney in a straight vertical line, which in still cold air meant the fire was well managed and the draw was working. She noted this. He dismounted and she dismounted, and they unloaded the trunk and the bags with the wordless cooperation of two people who are both physically capable and who do not need to narrate their actions to each other. He held the door, and she went in. Inside was what she had constructed in her imagination from his letter and the agency's description and her own experience of how men who lived alone arranged things, which is to say, functional and unsentimental and cleaner than most people expected. The main room was larger than the outside had suggested, with the fireplace on the north wall and a wood stove in the corner and a table that could seat 6 in the middle of the room and currently had a lamp on it and nothing else. The bookshelves above the fireplace were full, which she noted. The floor was swept. The cooking area was organized with the economy of someone who had been organizing it for a long time and had arrived at a system that worked. On the eastern wall between the two windows there was a strip of old lace curtain, white gone to ivory, with age nailed at the top so that it hung against the log wall. It was the only thing in the room that served no function she could identify. She looked at it for 2 seconds and then looked away. She would think about it later. He showed her the room in back. It was small, and it had a window facing west, and it had a bed which was narrower than she would have preferred, and made with the concentrated efficiency of a man who had constructed it for a person whose dimensions he had been mistaken about. There was a hook on the wall for clothes. There was a small stand for a basin. It was not much, and it was also completely adequate in the ways that mattered, and she had lived in smaller. He stood in the doorway while she looked at the room. He said, "It is small." She said, "It will do." He said, "I can make it longer. The frame, if you need the length." She turned and looked at him then, because this was an unexpected thing, and she wanted to see his face when he said it. His face was the same as it had been, not precisely readable, but not closed either, offering the sentence as a piece of information the way he had offered the information about Clara's ear. She said, "That would be helpful." He nodded. He went away to deal with the horses. She stood in the small room for a moment alone with her trunk at the foot of the bed, and the sound of him moving in the barn outside, and the sound of the fire in the other room, and the sound of the mountain, which was not silence exactly, but was the absence of all the sounds she was used to, and which would take some time to stop being what it was now, which was loud in its own way, the loudness of everything that is not there. She thought, well, here I am then. It was not a romantic thought. It was not a frightened one. It was simply the thought of a person who has arrived somewhere real after a long time in transit, and who is now in the business of figuring out what that means. She unpacked the things that needed unpacking and left the rest for morning, and went out to find that he had put food on the table, which was venison stew, and that there were 2 bowls and 2 spoons laid out with the careful exactness of a man who had set the table for 1 person for so long that setting it for 2 required deliberate thought. They ate. He did not talk. She did not talk. The fire moved in the stove. The wind came up outside and then went somewhere else. It was, she thought, a beginning. Whether it was the beginning of something or only the beginning of a long, difficult winter with a stranger, she did not yet know. But she had made her choice, and she was here, and the mountain was outside, and the stew was good. She ate all of it. The first morning she woke before he did, which she suspected was unusual for him, based on the evidence of a man who had organized his life around the logic of available light. The cabin was cold in the way that a well-built cabin is cold in the early morning of a Montana winter, which is to say, thoroughly, without the draftiness of a bad cabin, but with the settled patient cold of stone and air that has been sitting in the dark for hours without the fire's company. She dressed in the dark, which was something she was practiced at from years of early mornings at the cooperage, and she went out to the main room and found the stove and got the fire going from the banked coals with the ease of someone who understood fire as a practical matter rather than a romantic one. By the time Callum appeared from his end of the cabin, which was through a door she had not registered as a door the night before, the stove had been going for 20 minutes, and the room was on its way to warm, and there was water heated for coffee. He stopped in the doorway of his room and looked at the stove, and then at her, and then at the stove again. She said, "I could not find where you keep the coffee." He crossed to the shelf above the cooking area and brought down a tin and set it on the table without comment. They had coffee. He was not a man who talked in the morning, which she determined within the first 10 minutes of that first day, and which she found she did not object to. She was not much of a morning talker either. The cooperage had been a talking place full of the constant social noise of people who worked in close quarters and filled the space with words, the way water fills a container. But she had never fully been a part of that. Current had always been somewhat to the side of it, contributing when she had something to contribute and otherwise listening. He was out the door before the sun was fully over the eastern ridge. She heard him in the barn, the particular sounds of a man attending to horses, methodical and unhurried. She cleared the coffee things and looked at the room and made assessments. The cabin was on closer inspection even better built than she had thought the night before. The chinking between the logs was careful and complete. The floor planks were fitted tightly. The wood stove was a good one, iron heavy gauge, the kind that held heat for hours after the fire was reduced. The shelves were built into the wall, not just set against it, which was the kind of detail that told you something about the person who built them, about whether they were thinking of something permanent or something provisional. He was thinking of something permanent. She had already known this from the letter, but it was useful to have it confirmed in wood and iron. She found the broom and swept the floor, which was already clean, but which she swept anyway because there is a kind of contact that sweeping makes with a space that is useful when the space is new. She looked at every corner. She looked at the east wall with the strip of lace curtain. She did not touch it. She found the food stores in the root cellar, which was accessed through a door in the floor near the back of the cabin. This was well organized, better organized than she had expected, with the dried goods on one side and the preserved items on the other, and the root vegetables in the center bins. He was not running short of anything. He was, by any reasonable measure, better provisioned than most households she had known in Boston. She thought about what to make for the noon meal and found what she needed and made it. He came in at noon with the look of a man who had done 4 hours of work already and who was not particularly thinking about food, but who had come in because noon was when a person came in. He looked at the table where she had put out the meal and then at her, and then he sat down and ate with the steady, economical attention of a man for whom eating is a practical matter. He said halfway through, "The beavers have moved their dam on the upper creek. I need to relocate 2 of my trap sets." She said, "Does that happen often?" He said, "When the water level changes. The snowpack is heavier than last year on the north face. It changes things below." She said, "How do you know the snowpack is heavier?" He looked up from his plate. He looked at her as though determining whether the question was genuine curiosity or social politeness. Apparently he determined correctly, because he said, "The angle of the drifts on the ridge faces, and the way sound carries in the morning. Heavy snow absorbs differently than light pack." She said, "I would not have known that." He said, "Why would you? It was not unkind, it was simply accurate." She said, "I would like to learn it." He ate. He said nothing for a while. "Then some of it cannot be learned quickly." She said, "I did not say quickly." He looked at her again with the same quality of attention. Then he went back to his plate. That afternoon she found the 3 places where the roof leaked. She did not find them by going up on the roof. She found them by standing in the main room and looking at the ceiling planks and identifying the 3 areas where the wood showed the faint discoloration of repeated wetting and drying over multiple seasons, which was something she had learned to read from the cooperage, where the condition of wood was the primary text of the work. The 3 spots corresponded with the corners and a midpoint section, which told her something about the structure of the roof above and where the stress was accumulating. She went out and looked at the roof from the ground, and then she went to the barn and found the short ladder and the cedar shingles he kept in the back corner of the barn, which were there because he knew about the leaks and had not gotten to them yet, and she took the ladder and the shingles and the nails she found in the tin on the workbench, and she went to the roof. She was halfway through the first repair when she heard him come out of the tree line at the edge of the clearing. He stopped. She heard the particular quality of a stopped person, which is different from the sound of a moving person, even when neither is making noise you would normally call a sound. He said from below, "Get down." She said without stopping what she was doing, "The first 2 are done. The third one is at the far corner. The flashing has lifted away from the chimney surround." He said, "Get down right now." She finished driving the nail she was driving. She looked at the third site, which was as she had described. Then she came down the ladder, not because he had told her to, but because she had intended to come down anyway, and she was not going to misrepresent that. She descended and picked up the ladder and looked at him. His face was doing something she had not seen it do yet, which was an active suppression of something that wanted to come out. She had the impression of a man who had prepared several things to say and was trying to determine which one was appropriate for a person standing on a roof without permission. He said finally, "You could have come through." She said, "The boards are sound. I tested each one." He said, "You tested them from underneath, not from above under load." She said, "I know the difference between a load-bearing plank and a decorative one. I have worked with wood for 12 years. He said, "This is not a cooperage." She said, "The principles of structural wood are the same." He stood there with the particular stillness of a man who has had an argument taken away from him before he was finished with it. She could see him reassessing the way he had reassessed at the stagecoach, moving through the available responses and finding that most of them were either inaccurate or unfair. He said, "The third repair, the chimney flashing." She said, "The right front corner. The nail has corroded through and the flashing has curled up approximately 2 inches. I can see daylight through it from inside." He was quiet. She said, "I did not go up there to prove anything. I went up there because it needs doing and I could see how to do it." He said after a moment, "I know it needs doing." She said, "I know you know." They looked at each other in the cold afternoon light with the unfinished roof between them. He said finally, "Tomorrow morning, I will do the third one." She picked up the shingles and the nails and she said, "All right." She put them back in the barn where she had found them. That night he sawed an extension piece for the bed frame without being asked again, working in the barn by lamplight after the supper dishes were done, and she heard the saw going in the quiet. And she understood something, not everything, but something about the way he moved through the world, which was by actions rather than words, by the adjustment of physical things to physical needs, and which was something she could respect, even if it was not the whole of what she thought a person needed. She lay in the lengthened bed and looked at the ceiling and listened to the saw and thought, "We are two people who are both trying to figure out if this is possible." It was not certainty, but it was something. The second day she found the routine of the place by working within it, which was her instinct with any new system to learn the existing logic before proposing changes. He rose at first light, tended the horses, ate, went out. She rose at first light, managed the fire, and the morning meal, ate, and began to learn the inside of the cabin, the way you learn something you are going to be responsible for. She found where he kept everything. She learned the root cellar's organization with enough precision to know what needed restocking before he would notice it needed restocking. She found the small repair she could make to the hinge on the cellar door which had been rubbing, and made it. She found the book on the shelf above the fireplace that had been set back slightly from the others, as though it had been removed and replaced many times, and the replacement was slightly less exact each time. The spine read, "Whitman." She did not take it down. She looked at it and left it. The third day he came in from checking his trap line and said, "There is a heifer down on the Oaks place, the east pasture. She has been down since yesterday morning, they think. Hattie Oaks is asking if I know anything about it." She said, "What are the symptoms?" He looked at her. She said, "I grew up on a farm in Ireland until I was 11, before Boston." He said, "She is lying on her right side and not getting up. Breathing is labored. They found her yesterday at dawn." She said, "Has she eaten recently?" He said, "They think not for 2 days." She said, "Bloat most likely if she has been grazing on the lower pasture. The wet grass on the south-facing slopes can cause it this time of year if the temperature swings the way it has been swinging. The animal needs to be positioned on her sternum if possible and walked if she can walk. If she cannot walk, they need to release the gas from the rumen. Has she been treated?" Callum was looking at her with an expression she had not seen on him yet. She said, "It is probably too late if it has been 2 days. But those are the steps." He went out. He came back in the evening and said without preamble, "She is standing. Hattie Oaks says, 'Thank you.' She said, 'I am glad.'" He sat down at the table and ate his supper. Halfway through he said into the space above his plate rather than directly to her, "Where else did you work? Besides the cooperage and the farm?" She said, "My uncle had a slaughterhouse in South Boston. I worked there 2 summers when I was 18 and 19. And before the cooperage I worked at a laundry, and before that I tended children for a family on Beacon Hill for 3 years. He said, "How old were you when you came from Ireland?" She said 11. My parents died the same winter. There was a passage available and my mother's sister was in Boston. So I went. He ate. She said, I have been working since I was 11 years old. He said, I know that kind of life. She said, I thought you might. The fourth day she overheard him, or rather she heard him since she was not attempting concealment, and neither was he talking to his horse in the barn. She was crossing the yard with the water bucket and the barn door was open, and she heard his voice low and unhurried saying something that she caught only partially. Something about the weather changing and the upper trail being icy for the next few days and the need to be careful. He was talking to the horse the way some men talk to horses when they are alone, which is to say with more ease than they talk to people. She heard his voice low and unhurried in the barn. She kept walking and continued to the well. The fifth day she made too much of the morning meal, not through carelessness, but because she was still calibrating the quantities for 2 people rather than 1, and there was a surplus of cornmeal porridge that she left on the stove. He came in, looked at the pot, and ate a second portion without comment. He ate the second portion and said nothing. She adjusted her estimate going forward, and she adjusted her estimate going forward. The 6th day he found her behind the barn splitting wood. She had found the maul and the splitting block in the morning, and she had assessed the woodpile, which was substantial, but which would not last the remaining winter at the rate she estimated the stoves were consuming, and she had decided the sensible thing was to add to it during the hours in the afternoon when she had completed the indoor work and before the light went. She was not trying to make a point. She was splitting wood because the wood needed splitting. He came around the corner of the barn and stopped. She brought the maul down and the round split cleanly, and she moved the halves off the block and set the next one and split it. He watched her for a moment and said nothing. She said, "The pile by the south wall is getting short. I thought I would work on the rounds from the fall cutting." He said, "Those are the rounds I was going to split this week." She said, "I can stop." He said, "No." She split another round. He said, "You have done this before." She said, "My uncle's farm had 4 fireplaces." He said, and she could not entirely read the tone, "Is there anything you have not done?" She thought about it seriously the way she thought about most questions, without the instinct to deflect into modesty. She said, "I have not skinned a bear." He said nothing for a moment. Then he said, "That is a skill set that takes time." She said, "I assumed." She split another round. He went into the barn. She thought she might have heard something from inside the barn that was not the sound of the horses, and was not words, but was something. She did not stop splitting wood to investigate. The 7th day she found the lace curtain's meaning or part of it. She had not asked. She had been looking at it every day from the corner of her eye, noting the way it did not belong with the rest of the cabin's ascetic logic, the way it sat on the east wall between the 2 windows like a piece of punctuation in a text where it had no grammatical function. She had built several theories and discarded them as insufficient, and had been patient because she was good at patience when patience was the right tool. She was at the table mending a pair of his work socks which she had found in a basket with other items that needed attention, and he was at the other end of the table cleaning his rifle, and they were in the comfortable working silence they had been arriving at by degrees over the course of the week, which was not the silence of people who have nothing to say, but the silence of people who do not need to fill space with words in order to feel the other person's presence. He said abruptly, "She put it there." She said, "I know," he said after a pause. "You have been looking at it." She said, "Yes." He said, "Eleanor." She said, "I thought so." He said, "She said the cabin needed something that was not useful. She could not abide a place with only useful things in it. She said it made her feel like livestock." Bridget looked at the curtain. She thought about a woman who had lived in this cabin and found it insufficient, and had put a piece of lace on the wall as a statement of something she needed that the place did not provide. She said, "What did you think when she said that he was quiet for a long time?" Long enough that she thought he was not going to answer. Then he said, "I thought she was wrong. I thought if everything was useful, you would not waste time on the things that were not." She said, "And now," he said more slowly, "now I think we were talking about different things, and neither of us understood it at the time." She said nothing. She went back to the sock. He said I left it there because taking it down felt like a kind of erasure that I did not want to commit, even after she was gone. She said, I understand that. He said, do you? She said, when my parents died, my mother had a green glass bottle on the windowsill in the kitchen. It was not useful. It was only there because the light came through it in the afternoon, and she liked the color it made on the floor. When I left Ireland, I could not take it. I thought about that bottle for 20 years. He set down the rifle and looked at her, not the assessing look, something less guarded than that. She said, the lace curtain does not bother me. You should know that. He said I did not know how to ask without it being a large question. She said, it is not a large question. It is only a curtain. He picked up the rifle again. She sewed the sock. Outside, the wind moved in the pines, and the fire in the stove made its small sounds, and the light through the east windows was the clear, thin light of late winter afternoon in the mountains, and neither of them said anything more for a long time, and it was not an uncomfortable silence. It was, in fact, almost the opposite. On the 7th night, she lay in the extended bed and looked at the ceiling and thought about the week that had passed, which had been harder and less hard than she had expected in alternating measure, as most real things are. She thought about the roof and the heifer and the woodpile and the lace curtain and the sentence about Eleanor not abiding a place with only useful things in it. She thought about the man on the other side of the cabin wall who had spent 6 years alone on this mountain and who had asked in a letter he had sat with for 3 days before mailing for someone durable, and who had also written in smaller letters that he did not know how to want company in the ordinary way. She thought she was beginning to understand what he had meant by that. Not that he did not want it, only that wanting it had been for a long time something he did in the small letters at the bottom of the page beneath the practical requirements in the handwriting of a man who was not sure it would be received. She went back to the sock. He went back to the rifle. The fire in the stove made its small sounds. After a while, he said, without looking up, my mother had a blue pitcher. She kept it on the kitchen windowsill in Ohio, never used it for water. Only ever for cut flowers from the yard, and only in summer. Bridget did not look up either. She said, what happened to it? He said, I do not know. I left Ohio at 19 and did not go back. She said nothing. She finished the sock and folded it and set it on the pile. He set down the rifle and went to bed. She sat for a moment longer in the quiet. The lace curtain was the same as it had always been. But the room, she thought, was not quite the same as it had been an hour ago. She put out the lamp. There is a particular kind of knowing that does not arrive all at once, but builds the way a fire builds when the conditions are right slowly at first, and then with a momentum that is its own fed by small things that would not amount to much individually, but that together constitute something that cannot be mistaken for anything else. Bridget Calhoun had spent her adult life paying attention to this kind of knowing, which was less dramatic than the kind that arrives in a single moment of revelation, but which was in her experience considerably more reliable. The second week on Bear Creek Ridge began with snow, not the light, apologetic snow of a system passing through, but the serious, committed snow of a storm that had been building over the northern ranges for 3 days, and that arrived in the early hours of Monday morning with the settled authority of a storm that had decided what it is going to do and is not interested in negotiation. She heard it before she was fully awake, the change in the quality of the silence outside, which was no longer the clear, cold silence of a still night, but the muffled, pressurized silence of a world being covered. She rose and went to the window and looked out at nothing because there was nothing to see yet but white coming down in the dark. And then she went to the stove and rebuilt the fire, which she had done every morning for 7 days now with enough consistency that the process had stopped requiring thought and had entered the category of things the hands know. He was up 20 minutes later, which was earlier than usual, which told her he had heard the storm too and had made the same assessment she had made, which was that animals in barns on mornings like this needed attention before they needed feeding. He came through from his end of the cabin and stopped when he saw the stove already going. He looked at it for a moment, and then looked at her, and then got his coat and went to the barn. She made the breakfast. By the time they had eaten, the snow was coming down with the settled steadiness of a storm that intended to be there for a while. He brought in extra wood from the lean-to on the south side of the cabin, 4 loads, stacking it inside along the north wall in the methodical way he did most things. She watched the size of the stack he was building and revised her estimate of how long he thought the storm would last. She said, 3 days. He said, setting down the fourth load. At least. She said, what needs doing outside that cannot wait? He looked at her. She said, I am asking practically. I am not proposing to go stand in the snow for the experience of it. He said, the horses will be fine. I have already broken the ice on the trough and there is feed for 4 days. The trap lines will have to wait. There is nothing else outside that cannot wait. She said, then we are inside for 3 days. He said, yes. She looked at the stack of wood and the stocked shelves and the root cellar door and thought, we are 2 people who have been in this cabin for 1 week and who are now going to be in it together for 3 more days without the relief valve of either of them going outside for any extended period. She thought, well, this is the kind of thing that either helps or does not. She got out the mending basket, which she had been working through steadily since the 2nd day. He got out a length of rawhide he was working into a new set of reins, which was the kind of work that could be done at a table without tools. They worked. The snow came down outside with complete indifference to their situation. The first day of the storm was quiet in the way of 2 people who are still mostly strangers and who have not yet worked out how to be in a confined space together for a long time. There was a kind of low-level awareness of the other person that was not uncomfortable exactly, but that required some management. The way a new piece of furniture in a familiar room requires adjustment of the pathways you have always used without thinking. She read in the afternoon. He read in the evening. They did not read the same thing at the same time, which would have felt like an intimacy they had not arrived at, but they occupied the same room with their separate books, and the fire, and the sound of the storm which was increasing as the afternoon went on. And this was its own kind of thing, its own category of domestic arrangement that was different from being alone, and different from the social performance of being with people, and that she did not have a precise word for. He cooked the evening meal, which surprised her, not because she had thought he could not cook, but because she had assumed the division of labor had settled itself in the first week into a pattern she would need to actively renegotiate later. He made the same venison stew he had made the first night with dried beans added and more of the root vegetables from the cellar, and it was good, better than she would have expected from a man who had been cooking for himself for 6 years, which spoke to a standard he had maintained even in the absence of anyone to maintain it for. She said, this is well made. He said, Emmett Pruitt taught me. He was a better cook than most people gave him credit for. She said, you have mentioned him before. He died last year, he said, late October. The avalanche on the north face of the second ridge. He had been checking my upper trap line as a favor because I had been sick the week before and the line needed checking. He said this without the kind of inflection that invites further inquiry, but also without the kind of inflection that closes a subject which she was coming to understand was his characteristic approach to difficult things, stating them plainly and then leaving the door open or closed, depending on something she had not yet identified. She said, he was checking your line when it happened. He said, yes. She said, that is a hard thing to carry. He said, yes. They ate. The storm pressed against the cabin walls with the low, continuous sound of wind that has found its direction and committed to it. She said after a while, did he know that it was his line? He looked up. She said, did Emmett know he was checking your line because you had been ill when it happened? Did he know the last thing he did was a favor for you? Callum set down his spoon. He looked at the table for a long moment. He said, I have thought about that. She said, and? He said, I think he knew. Emmett always knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. He was that kind of man. She said, then he died doing something he had chosen to do for someone he wanted to do it for. That is not the worst thing. He looked at her with the quality of attention that she had learned to recognize as his version of being genuinely moved by something which was not visible on his face the way it would be on most faces, but was present in the stillness, in the particular quality of the pause before he spoke. He said, no, it is not the worst thing. They finished the meal. She cleared the table. He went to the south window and looked at the weather, which told him something she could not read, and then he put more wood on the stove, and they settled into the evening routine that had developed in the first week, him with his work and her with her book, the fire between them and the storm outside. Before he went to bed, he said without looking up from the rawhide, "He told me I would die alone on this mountain. 3 days before nobody knew." She said Emmett did. He said yes, he generally did. He went to bed. She sat by the fire for a while longer and thought about a man she had never met who had told the truth to his friend and who had died doing a kindness and who had left behind in the shape of his absence the letter that had brought her here. She thought Emmett Pruitt. "I owe you something and I will never be able to pay it." She went to bed. The second day of the storm was different from the first in a way that was difficult to define precisely. The storm itself was the same or heavier. The cabin was the same. They were the same two people with the same week of cautious, careful coexistence behind them. But something about the second day of being confined in the same space with a person is different from the first day, because the first day you are still managing it consciously, and the second day the management has begun to slip in the way that all conscious management of natural conditions eventually slips, and what comes through is less curated. He was at the table working on the reins when he said without preamble and without looking up the fabric at the general store. "The blue wool. What did you end up doing with it?" She looked at him. He said, still not looking up, "I saw you look at it through the window. When you came in for supplies your second day. Greer's window." She said, "I did not buy it. I was looking at the weight of it, the nap. I thought it might be appropriate for a vest for working in cold weather without the bulk of a coat." He said nothing for a moment. "Then Greer's carries a good medium weight. The heavier stuff is more than you need unless you are outside all day." She said, "That was my assessment as well." He said, "Tommy Greer will be up next week for the supply run. Assuming the road is passable after this. You can send a note down if you want something." She said, "I will think about it." He went back to his work. She went back to her book. But something had shifted in the room in a way that was not large and was not small, only the way a door shifts when someone puts their hand on it without yet pushing through. She had been thinking about Tommy Greer intermittently since the first day, not with suspicion exactly, but with the particular attention she gave to things that contained more than they appeared to on the surface. He was a young man with an open face and a generous manner and genuinely useful knowledge of the local terrain, and he had made it apparent at the stagecoach and again at the street that he considered her situation on Bear Creek Ridge somewhat precarious and himself possibly relevant to the improvement of it. She had not decided what to do with this. She had decided to continue observing. She said after a while, "What do you know about the Greer family?" "Callum said old Greer has run the store for 20 years. Before that, he came from Ohio. Tommy was born here. His mother died when he was 12. He has run his father's delivery route since he was 16. She said, "He seems to know everyone and everything in the valley." He said he does. He is that kind of person. She said, "Is he trustworthy?" Callum looked up from the reins. He looked at her with the steady, measuring look. He said, "Trustworthy how?" She said, "In general. As a person." He said, "He is not dishonest. He is young, and he has not had enough happen to him yet to know the weight of things." She said, "That is a careful answer." He said, "It is an accurate one." She said, "Does it bother you that he speaks to me?" The question landed in the room with more clarity than she had entirely intended. She had meant it as a practical inquiry, an assessment of whether there was a dynamic she needed to understand, but she heard when it was out that it was also more than that. He set the rawhide down. He said after a moment that was long enough to be honest and short enough not to be evasive, "Yes." She said, "Why?" He said, "Because I do not know what his intentions are, and I am not in a position to ask, and I do not like things I cannot read." She said, "You could ask me." He said, "I am asking you now, indirectly." She said, "His intentions are his own problem. Mine are what you should be concerned with." He said, "What are yours?" She said, "I am here. I chose to be here. I am not in the habit of choosing things and then reconsidering them every time something adjacent to them presents itself." He looked at her for a long moment. Not the assessing look and not the guarded look either. something in between those and something else that she did not yet have a full name for. He said, "I understand that. I have not always behaved in ways consistent with understanding it." She said, "No, but you are not doing badly at the moment." He picked up the rawhide. She picked up her book. The storm went on outside in the way that storms do without any particular investment in the human arrangements occurring inside the walls it was pressing against. She found herself thinking not for the first time that she was a woman who had spent 31 years learning to read things accurately, and that the most interesting reading she had done in some time was being done in a cabin on a mountain in Montana in the middle of a 3-day storm, which was not where she had expected to find the most interesting reading material, but then most of the best things she had found in her life had not been where she had expected to find them. The 3rd day of the storm, the snow stopped in the mid-afternoon, and the sky cleared with the abruptness that follows a large weather system's departure, going from white and closed to a blue so sharp and clean it seemed almost aggressive. The light that came through the cabin windows in the late afternoon of that 3rd day was the light of a world that had been remade overnight. All the reference points softened under white. The distances changed, the familiar shapes of the tree line and the ridges above made new. She stood at the south window and looked at it. He came to stand at the window also, not beside her, but near, and they both looked at the altered landscape for a while in the way that people look at things that are genuinely beautiful without feeling the need to narrate the beauty. He said, "The upper trail will be impassable for 2 days, maybe 3, she said. And then, he said, and then the traps need checking, and there will be more to do than usual for a while. She said, I can help with the outdoor work. He said, I know you can. She said, you have been deciding how to feel about that. He said, yes. She said, have you decided? He was quiet. Outside, the light was doing something extraordinary on the fresh snow, the particular low-angle winter light that catches ice crystals in the top layer and makes the whole surface appear to be lit from within rather than from above. She had never seen snow do quite this before, the city snow of Boston being a different and considerably less beautiful substance. He said, my father was a man who believed that the measure of a man was what he could do for himself and for the people in his care. That a man who needed help with the physical work of his life was diminished by that need. She said, and you believe that? He said slowly, I believed it for a long time because I had not considered whether I believed it or whether I had simply inherited it without examination. There is a difference. She said, there is. He said, I am examining it now. It is taking longer than I would prefer. She turned and looked at him. Then, because this was the most he had said at one time about the inside of himself since she had arrived, and she wanted to see his face while he said it. His face was its usual face, not offering more than it intended, but there was something in it that was not there on the first day or the second day or any day in the first week, which was the quality of a person who is saying the true thing out loud for the first time and finding that it does not kill them. She said, take the time you need. I am not going anywhere. He said, I know. That is part of what makes it possible to examine. They stood at the window for a little longer. Then she went to start the evening meal, and he went to get more wood from the lean to which was something to do that was not the conversation they had just had and which they both needed. Tommy Greer came up the mountain on a Thursday, 6 days after the storm. On the first day the road was fully passable. He came with the supply horse and the monthly list that Callum had sent down before the storm, and he came also with the particular alertness of a young man who has been thinking about something for 2 weeks and has arrived at the location of that something and is trying to appear as though this is simply a routine visit. Bridget saw him coming through the tree line from the kitchen window. She finished what she was doing, which was assembling the components for a midday meal, and she went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch because she preferred to meet things directly. He pulled up his horse and looked at her and smiled the good, easy smile. He said, Miss Calhoun, you survived the storm then? She said, we did. Come up and I will get you coffee while you unload. He came up to the porch and she poured coffee from the pot on the stove, and he stood at the kitchen end of the main room and looked around at the cabin with the unconscious assessment of a person who is trying to determine the condition of a situation without appearing to do so. He said, the place looks well kept. She said, it was well kept when I arrived. I have maintained the standard. He said, is he treating you fairly? Callum, she said, looking at him directly. Yes. He said, "He can be hard. He has been alone a long time, and alone can become a habit that makes a person difficult to be around." She said, "Mr. Greer, you have been kind and I appreciate it, but I want to be clear with you about something." He waited. She said, "I am not a situation that needs managing from the outside. I am a woman who made a decision and who is in the process of living with it. If I had concerns about my situation, I am capable of expressing them to the appropriate person, which would be either Callum or, if it came to that, Sheriff Duggan. It would not be you." He held the coffee cup in both hands and looked at her with an expression that moved through several things quickly, including surprise and something that was not quite hurt and something that was closer to respect than either of those. He said, "I did not mean to imply you could not handle yourself." She said, "I know. You meant to be helpful. It is a good impulse, but it is aimed at the wrong target." He said, "He is lucky then, if that is how you see it." She said, "I do not know yet if luck is the right word. Ask me in the spring." He almost smiled. She did smile briefly because she had no particular animus toward Tommy Greer, and the conversation was going where it needed to go, and she appreciated that he was receiving it without making it difficult. He said, "I brought the things on the list. There is also a letter for you. Came in on the mail from Billings day before yesterday." She said, "Thank you." He unloaded the supply horse with the efficiency of someone who had done this many times on this particular mountain. Callum came in from the east pasture where he had been clearing the snow from the outbuilding roof and took stock of what had arrived and said to Tommy in the plain way he said most things, "Stayed on the road this time." Tommy said, "The drifts on the lower switchback are still deep on the east side. I came up the west track." Callum said, "The west track is slower." Tommy said, "Yes, but it was passable." This exchange, she observed, contained a significant amount of information packed into a small number of words, which was the characteristic communication style of men who had known each other in a particular way for a long time, not as friends exactly, but as people whose lives occupied adjacent territory and who had developed the shorthand of that adjacency. There was no warmth in it and no hostility. It was simply functional, which was its own kind of relationship. Tommy finished with the horse and drank the rest of his coffee and prepared to leave. At the door he paused and said to the general room, rather than to either of them specifically, "The social at Millhaven Church is the second Saturday of next month. If either of you has a mind to come down, Mrs. Dugan organizes it." Callum said nothing. Bridget said, "Thank you for letting us know." Tommy rode back down the mountain. She watched him go through the kitchen window and then turned back to the meal. Callum was at the table looking at the supply list and comparing it to what had arrived, which was his habitual verification that the order had been filled correctly. He said without looking up, "What did he want?" She said, "To check on me, and to see what was here to see." He said, She said, "And I told him I was not a situation that required managing from outside." He looked up from the list. She was at the stove, and she felt the look rather than saw it the way you feel when someone in a room has turned their full attention in your direction. He said, "What did he say to that?" She said, "He took it well. He is a decent young man who has not yet learned that decent impulses are not always relevant." He went back to the list. He said, "The flour is right. The salt is 2 pounds short." She said, "I noticed. I will note it for next month." He said, "Noted." The letter was from her brother Declan. She read it in her room in the evening, sitting on the edge of the extended bed with the lamp on the stand beside her. Declan wrote the way he spoke in long, looping sentences that circled the point several times before arriving at it, and with the characteristic blend of genuine affection and mild guilt that was the texture of their relationship since the bank had taken most of the house. He wrote that he hoped she was warm and that the man was treating her right. He wrote that the cooperage was definitely closing in March, which meant her timing had been, as he put it, not the worst in the world. He wrote that Mrs. Rafferty next door had fallen and broken her wrist, and that her cat had been living in their kitchen for the past 2 weeks and showing no signs of leaving. He wrote that he missed her, which she knew, and that he was proud of her, which he said less often than he meant it. He wrote near the end, "I have been thinking about what you said before you left, that Boston stopped being a place where you could find out. I think I understand that better now than I did then. I think you were telling me something true that I did not want to hear because I was afraid it might be true about me too, that I had stopped trying to find out and had started only trying to manage what was already there. She read this paragraph twice. She thought about Declan, who was not a bad man, only a man who had made the smaller choice at every fork for so many years that he had arrived somewhere quite small without entirely meaning to. She thought about herself 11 years old on a boat crossing the Atlantic with everything that mattered to her people already gone, which was perhaps the first time she had understood that the world did not arrange itself around a person's preferences, and that the most useful thing a person could do was become someone who could manage what was actually there. She wrote back to him that evening before the lamp burned down. She told him the cooperage closing was not a surprise and that she hoped he would use the time to reconsider some things. She told him the mountain was what she had expected, and more than she had expected in ways she could not easily describe in a letter. She told him she was not yet sure of everything, but she was sure of the important thing, which was that she had been right to come. She sealed the letter and put it on the shelf by the door to go down with Tommy Greer's next visit. She lay in the dark and thought about being right to come. She thought about the specific inventory of the past 2 weeks: the roof, the heifer, the wood, the 3 days of storm, the conversation at the window about the light on the snow, the sentence about examining inherited beliefs. She thought about Declan's sentence for a while, that he had stopped trying to find out and had started only trying to manage what was already there. She recognized the distinction because she had been close to it herself once. The 7 years after Seamus were years of management mostly. Getting through, keeping the cracks stepped over. She had come here to find out. That was the honest version of it. What she had not anticipated was that finding out might require patience of a kind she had not previously been asked for. Not the patience of waiting for something to happen which she was practiced at, but the patience of allowing something to happen at the pace it needed to happen, which was different and which she was still learning. He was not a man who could be rushed toward himself. She understood this now in a way she had only suspected on the train. You could not ask him directly for the thing you wanted. You could only be present while he arrived at it, which was its own kind of work, and which required her to be a different kind of person than the one who had pinned a man against a wall in Billings Station without breaking stride. She was not in love with him. She was honest enough to know that much. Love in her experience was a conclusion, and she was still reading the evidence. But she was also honest enough to know that she had stopped somewhere in the last 2 weeks calculating whether this was possible and had started simply living as though it was. That was not nothing. That was in fact most of it. She sealed Declan's letter and put it on the shelf by the door and went to bed without lighting the lamp. She closed her eyes. Outside, the mountain was enormous and still and cold. Inside, the fire was banked and the cabin was warm, and on the wall between the east windows, the ivory lace curtain was the same as it had always been, belonging to a story that was not finished, which was the condition of all stories that anyone was still inside. 3 days later, on a Sunday, she came around the corner of the barn in the late morning and found him standing absolutely still at the edge of the tree line, which was a thing she had learned to recognize as his version of focused attention. She stopped without making a sound. She looked where he was looking. There was an elk at the edge of the clearing 40 yards out, a cow elk standing in the way that prey animals stand when they have noticed something but have not yet decided whether the something is a threat. The elk was looking directly at Callum, who was not moving. Bridget was behind the corner of the barn and to the elk's left and downwind, which meant the animal had not registered her presence. She stayed still. For a full minute, nothing moved. The elk and the man regarded each other across the clearing with the focused, specific attention of two things that have recognized each other as real. Then the elk dropped her head and moved away into the trees unhurried, as though the conclusion she had reached was that this particular human was not currently relevant to her. Callum stood for a moment longer. Then he turned and saw Bridget at the corner of the barn. He said nothing. She said, "How long has she been coming to this edge?" He said, "Since October. She comes 3 or 4 times a week most weeks." She said, "You have not hunted her?" He said no. She said, "Why?" He looked at the tree line where the elk had gone. He said, "Emmett pointed her out to me first, last spring. He said she was too good a thing to shoot." She said, "Do you agree?" He said after a moment, "She is always alone. The cows travel in groups mostly. This one does not." She said Emmett knew her. He said, "He did. He called her Margaret, which was not a name I would have chosen for an elk, but that was Emmett." She looked at the empty tree line. She said, "Hello, Margaret." She said it quietly to the place where the elk had been, not expecting a response and not receiving one, only acknowledging the thing that had been there a moment ago. She was aware of Callum watching her while she did this. She turned back and looked at him. He said, "You are a strange woman." She said, "I know." He said, "I did not mean it as a criticism." She said, "I know that too." They went back to their separate work. But something had passed between them in the clearing that was not nothing, which was the acknowledgement that there were things on this mountain that mattered to him, that were not only practical, and that she had seen one of them and had treated it correctly, and that he had seen her treat it correctly, and had named her strangeness aloud, not to diminish it, but because the word was the right word, and he was a man who used the right word even when it cost him something. The following Tuesday she was in the root cellar doing inventory when she heard him come in from outside, the particular sound of his boots on the floor above her, and then a different sound, a chair moving, the sound of a man sitting down heavily in a way that was not his habitual way of sitting down. She came up from the cellar. He was at the table. He had his coat still on, which was unusual. His hat was on the table rather than on the hook by the door, which was also unusual. He was looking at his hands. She said, "What happened?" He said, "Nothing. Nothing happened." She said, "Something happened. You are sitting with your coat on, looking at your hands." He said, "I found the lower trap line. One of the traps had something in it that was not a beaver." She waited. He said, "A dog. Someone's dog. I do not know how it got that far up the mountain. It was a young dog, brown with one white ear." She said, "Dead." He said, "Yes. When I found it." She said nothing. She went to the stove and poured coffee and put it on the table in front of him. She sat down across the table. He said, "I know it is only a dog. It is not a significant thing." She said, "It is a significant enough thing that you came in and sat down with your coat on." He said, "I do not like finding things in traps that have no business being in traps." She said, "No, I would not either." He said the trap was the right trap in the right location. I did nothing wrong with the placement. She said, "I know." He said, "That does not make it less." She said, "No, it does not." He drank the coffee. She sat across from him and did not try to resolve the thing or minimize it or redirect him toward the practical steps of the situation. She simply sat there, which was its own form of thing, its own form of presence that said, "I am here, and this is real, and I am not going to pretend it is less than it is." After a while he took his coat off and hung it on the hook by the door. She said, "Did you move the trap?" He said, "Relocated the whole lower line, further east away from wherever that dog was ranging." She said, "That is the right thing." He said, "Yes." She said, "Are you hungry?" He said, "Not yet." She said, "All right." She went back to what she had been doing, which was mending, and he sat for a while longer, and then he went and got his Whitman from the shelf above the fireplace, which she had not seen him take down before in the 2 weeks she had been here, and he sat with it at the table and read. She did not look at what page he opened to, but she could see from where she was sitting that it was a page near the back in the last third of the book, and that the page was one of the ones with the corner folded down. She thought about a man who read poetry alone on a mountain and did not tell anyone, and who had a dead friend who had named an elk Margaret, and who had come in and sat down heavily at a table because a young dog with one white ear had been in a trap when it should not have been. She thought, "I would like to know this person. I would like to know all of this person. I think it is going to take a long time, and I think a long time is what I have, and I think that is right." She mended the sock she was working on and listened to the fire and did not say anything else, and neither did he, and it was the best evening they had had yet, which she was aware was a strange thing to think about. An evening that had started with a dog in a trap, but which was nevertheless true, because the best evenings are not always the ones where nothing hard is present, but sometimes the ones where the hard thing is present and is not being refused. The lamp burned down at its own pace. Outside the mountain was what it always was, which was large and cold and older than anything either of them had lived through, going about its seasons without consulting anyone, covering its dead under snow and uncovering them again in spring, keeping its own counsel about everything that moved across its surface, and reserving judgment the way old things reserve judgment until it had seen considerably more than 2 weeks of what these two particular people were going to make of the arrangement they had entered into in the full and partial knowledge they each had brought to it, which was to say the mountain was not finished watching yet. Neither were they.